Hi, this is Ted Price from Insomniac Games. Today on the Game Maker's Notebook, I spent time with Jonathan Blow, founder of Thekla and designer of Braid and The Witness. Jonathan expounded on a wide range of topics, including how game design is a very personal endeavor and how to think differently about puzzle design and what it can bring to players. He also talked about his current games in development and how creating his own programming language is one way to help coding evolve beyond its current state. And finally, he shared a few thoughts on what our industry could be doing better. Please join us.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
It's really nice to have you on. And I got to say, you are definitely one of the more high-profile folks in our industry. And I've watched a lot of your talks, read your interviews. You've been the subject of documentaries. And I just got to ask, what do you like talking about the most?
Well, I mean, there's different ways to answer that question. Like, I don't actually talk that much, right? Like, it's weird. Like, my job is not talking, right? Like, my job is sitting down and programming a lot and designing things. So, well, when I end up talking about things, I usually like talking about what I've been working on recently the most, right? That's like what's top of mind. And then I'm just always interested in talking about how to make games well. Like, making games is really hard, right? I mean, anyone who's tried it knows that. And just even getting to a baseline level of competence in how to make games is just like really hard, right? And so then if you want to go beyond that, it's like extra hard. You need some kind of extra juice to like get there. And it's always interesting to me to hear from other people like what they're doing to like try to really make something of unusually high quality. And so that's also what I like to talk about when I talk about things. That said, my ideas about how to do that often are a little bit contrarian, and so
well, that's okay. I mean, I think it's great that you present I think very a clear perspective, clear point of view whenever you talk, and you share your opinion without, I think, holding back. And I think we need that in this industry. And one of the things that you just said, and I've heard you say before, is that making games is hard. And I agree, right? I'm familiar with it. And I want to know, what about it is the hardest for you?
Oh boy. Okay. So there's so many things.
Well, let's narrow it down to the top two things.
Well, the things that come to mind right now. So, okay. The fundamental problem is just that there's so much work to do, right? And this manifests in a few different ways, right? So one, because even if you're not trying to make something super special, there's just a tremendous amount of work to do. And so by default, we end up making these big companies with like lots of very specialized roles, right? And then the fact that you have all these people working specialized roles means that communication is hard. That's just a known thing about teams, right? Especially specialized teams, is that the bigger they grow and the more specialized people become, the less natural your communication is, right? So firstly, I mean, I'm already fighting that problem all the time because, I've chosen not to go the big company route and get large amounts of funding, right? So our company is very small. So getting all the work done at all is hard. But then, the games I tend to make are trying to do very specific things that, and what that means varies from game to game. It's not like I have a consistent picture of what I'm trying to do. But one thing about that is we're usually trying to make things that other people wouldn't make, right? We have like a specific um, specific concept, and like that's the reason why we're making this thing. We're not just trying to make a playable game or a fun game. We're trying to make a playable, fun game that something, right? Whatever that thing is for this game. And that thing can be pretty subtle and difficult to achieve. And then just the more that you're bombarded by work you have to do, just the harder it is to do the extra part that you need in order to make the subtle different thing happen, right? And that to me is really hard. And then also, so my first well-known commercial game was Braid, which had a very small team behind it and came across as a very personal game, right? And that's one valuable thing that I've always thought that games could be, right? But then as games become larger, more industrialized productions, it's very easy to lose that ability. In fact, it happens very quickly to lose that ability to do something personal, which isn't, I don't know. This is where the discussion can already get really tangled and confusing because there are multiple things about that. Like there's something about things being personal that can help them be authentic, right, and valuable in a way that an audience will appreciate, but only if that person is authentic, right? Like there are sort of, games by individual creators that are more like egoic projections that are maybe not that interesting to people. But then also, like the personal part is not, I don't know, like there's a potential huge discussion to derail here because like I sort of watched the whole indie game design and development movement, go into overdrive after, around 2008 to 2010. And one thing that a lot of people sort of fetishize to some degree is this personal element. And there's something wrong about that too, so
wrong about the fetishization of indie games as a very personal endeavor, or wrong about trying to make it personal?
Like everything personal about every person is not interesting to every other person,
Mm-hmm.
Like just because something is yours and you made a very personal thing doesn't mean that that's a valuable export to other people. It's like there's something also, it took me a long time to understand this. I think I still don't really understand it, but in a personal artwork kind of situation, there's a little bit of a contract. It's like, okay, this thing is personal. It's not a large scale industrial thing. But part of the contract that I, as the author, am implicitly signing up for is that I'm giving you personal things that are going to be interesting to you somehow, right? Like there's some kind of I almost want to say like hygiene there, right? Like if you got up in the morning and you smell because you didn't take a shower the night before, like other people don't need to know that, And so like there's something there that I think was not really heeded in some way, but because I don't know, like, wow, this is really going into the weeds from where I thought we would go in the beginning, but like people like to be seen. And so if you decide that making games is a way to be seen and you find an avenue that way, it's, I almost don't know how to say this. Like there has to be some striving for what's good. Like what personal thing do you have that's good that is very much worth another person's time to sit there and experience, right? Because everybody has unique viewpoints, right? And parts of those viewpoints are really valuable, but parts of them aren't. And failure to acknowledge this, I think, is behind a lot of problems that we have. So like you go on Twitter and it's, there's some very interesting things that happen on Twitter, but a lot of it is just a giant cesspool of everybody yelling at everybody else. And like they're sharing their personal ideas or whatever, but it's just those things should not really be broadcast to the degree that we're broadcasting them, right? And so I don't know. Okay, let's get back to something more concrete, I guess.
Well, okay. I mean, these are conversations that are, I mean, they're difficult, but they're also at the heart of design, right? I mean, how do you, just on the personal side, because I know all of us who are in games, I'm making the assumption based on my own experience, usually have a message that we want to share. Could be anything, right?
Yeah.
Or we're putting ourselves out there for people to judge or to learn from. And how do you curate the personal message, right? Because your point is, a lot of us could say a lot of different things about what we believe. Not everything is potentially interesting to an audience. How do you make the call on Braid or Witness about what it is specifically that you want to say?
There's a feeling that just came to mind that'll link together what I was saying a second ago and maybe make it more purposeful, right? So it's something like the following. Let's say you're going to have a guest over at your house. That's a very personal thing. They're staying in your home, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you want your home to look nice for the guest, right? And like you have respect for the person that you're having stay over. And like again, you don't I don't know, you don't fumigate your house while your guest is staying over, right? You don't necessarily do 27 loads of laundry, like with the dirty laundry all over the floor. Like I wouldn't do that anyway, but like there's things that you wouldn't do while you have a guest over, right? And so there's some kind of thing that we already navigate in some contexts as human beings, where here's this personal situation, but it's curated in some sense, right? It's like I'm trying to make a good experience for you as a guest at my house, right? And so there's something like that in games. And again, I feel like, so on the one hand, I was one of the earlier people in the modern indie games development scene. And on the other hand, I have seen that what came out of that be something that I mostly don't like, right? And there are many dimensions of things that I don't like there, but one of them is this lack of just this thinking that everything that, like, it's very, like a very conceited author could just think that everything they do is interesting, right? So like if I invite someone to stay at my house, maybe I just feel like anything I do is totally fine and they should be happy with their stay at my house. And clearly that's not true, right? You could imagine some scenarios where you're like, oh man, like, yeah, I needed a place to sleep for a couple days, but like, I can't wait to get out of here because whatever terrible reasons. So there's something like that. There's a constant awareness when I design a game that it's for somebody. I don't know exactly who that is, but I am trying really hard, like for years, to give that person the best experience that I can give them. And there are personal things in the games, but they're directed toward giving the other person a good experience. They're not like directed toward, I want you to acknowledge me, right? Which is, I think, what some of indie game design turned into. And I don't think that's right. Or, I mean, I guess it's fine, but I don't think necessarily very many people are interested in that, right? I don't know. I mean, that said, there is a place for that too. Like in fiction, for example, there's some great works that are like that, but it's not most of them. And so, maybe it's just, it went too far that way.
I don't know. I mean, I look at a lot of indie games, and each one has a flavor to me that reflects its team, or if it's a single creator or two creators, the creator's personality, and they do often stand apart, which, to your point, makes them potentially not as attractive to a giant audience because we all don't have the same interests, right? But they are. I mean, to me, that's what's been exciting about indie games over the last, I'd say, 2 decades, really, is that you never know what you're going to see because the creative risks that people are taking on in the indie games are personal risks, right? I think that's really, to me, that's really interesting and inspiring. And I know that a lot of us who make the larger games look to indie games as sort of the big risk takers. Like your games do that too. When I played The Witness, I thought you took a lot of risks in terms of what you presented from a difficulty perspective, from a mechanics perspective. And that's great.
Yeah. That was actually okay. So, I've been in the games industry since the mid '90s, right? And so I've been going to conferences and all this stuff. And one thing that's been true for the entire time I've been in games, right, is there's some people saying, you know, AAA games, because that term's been around forever, right? AAA games are too commercial and don't take enough risks and all these things. And I used to feel that way too. Like in the '90s, I would be like, "Oh, I don't like big commercial games because, they're all remaking the same game and they're very boring and stuff." And then at some point, I came upon a more nuanced view of that. It was around so at GDC, I did this thing called the Experimental Gameplay Workshop. That I started. I had the idea of what to do. Like I was flying back from a vacation on an airplane, and I was like, I wrote this little manifesto that like it was just notes. It didn't ever get published anywhere, but it was like, yeah, like you kind of can't. Like, look, there's this whole system in place where, like, large commercial games, people value them because they provide certain kinds of guarantees about what you're going to get when you sit down to play the thing, right? It's like, look, when I go to Starbucks and get a drink, I don't want the barista to cry into my coffee or whatever, right? Like that's just not, I don't want that personal touch of the barista's life in my thing, right? So like there's a certain aspect of commercial product that people want, right? So that's what larger game, and the larger your budget is, the more you kind of have to do that, because it's not like it would be a virtuous choice to not do that with that much money, because the expected outcome would be that you would not make the money back, right? And then there just wouldn't be those games, right?
Well, let me provide a counterpoint though too. I do think that with a large budget and a larger team, you have the opportunity for a greater variety of gameplay experiences too. I mean, the larger games.
I think so, but the problem is the space is so large of what you could make, right? Like, let's just say you took off all assumptions about what we are sitting down to make in this game, or what we are allowed to do. Mm-hmm. You have a tremendous number of choices, and most of those choices result in a not very good game, right? Like, because that's what, if you have 37 decisions to make, and you need to make 33 of them well in order for the game to be good, and each one is 50-50, you're probably going to fail, because your expected number of good decisions at 50-50 is, what did I say, 37? So, 18, 19, right? So that's not enough. So it makes sense. So what the content of this manifesto was just like, look, it actually makes sense for small budget independent games that are risking relatively little to explore out some of these spaces and to prove them out at a smaller, safer budget level. Kind of like bigger studios would do sometimes with like prototyping, right? Except studios don't like prototype at scale, right? They don't prototype usually 50 games for every game that they make. That's just not really how that works. And so the idea was like, actually, if there's a healthy functioning ecosystem, it looks something like a lot of people doing experimentation at small budget level, some people succeeding financially at that budget level, which keeps that part of the system alive. And then people making bigger budget things, looking over at that thing and sort of exploiting those ideas, right? Which you could look at that cynically if you're the little guy, but you could also say, like, look, how else are those ideas ever supposed to reach a large audience, right? So that's how I started thinking about this a long time ago now, like almost 20 years ago. And I mean, I think my view of it has changed even one or two more times, but like sometimes this has happened very explicitly, like, and I'm totally okay with it. like the most explicit example I could think of. Are we allowed to talk about specific AAA games on the podcast?
It's up to you.
Will people
Yeah.
feel okay? Yeah. So, for example, Titanfall 2 came out a while ago, right? And it had a single player campaign, unlike the previous game, and that campaign got a lot of positive feedback from both critics and players alike. And one part of it that people really liked was this like reality jumping thing. And there were a whole bunch of levels in sequence where you sort of phase back and forth between two realities. And like that thing was a AAA budget level execution of something that a bunch of indie games had done. I'm not sure what game did it first, but it sort of got iterated in the indie game space. And very clearly people on that team just had looked at those games and said, hey, we could do this. Like, we see how this is fun. We see how we could plug it into this format that we have and make something better. And so those parts of this ecosystem just like worked together to produce this thing. And I'm actually okay with that. I wish AAA games would do that more than they do. But in this one case, so when I played that campaign, I had like, I felt both sides of it. On the one hand, I felt like, yeah, I've played this 7 times in smaller games, but I realized most people haven't, right? But on the other hand, it was like the campaign still felt really good because it was like, wow, they really brought this big extra thing that you wouldn't have expected. Like, they didn't have to do any of this, right? And the campaign just went like way further and bigger than you would have expected. And that was just like exciting, right? So I don't know. I feel like that's a correct functioning of the system. Like, one thing that indie developers have always liked to do is like be idealistic and have a lot of strong opinions about what people should be doing and so forth, right? And I think that's good. Like, we should have idealism and strong compasses about what are the right things to do, but also there's like reality, right? And so a correct idealistic opinion is some kind of idealism that actually is functional in reality and is just like, look, we could get from here to this other better situation over there if we make these kinds of decisions that are correct, right? Or we make these kinds of observations about what's playing out that are correct, right? And that kind of idealism is good, but unfortunately it's harder than the other kind of idealism, which is just yelling at people that they're not doing the thing that you imagine in your head that would be better, right? And I don't know. I think that like independent development had a little too much of that with regard to AAA. I don't know. At the same time, I don't play a lot of AAA games, so.
Well, yeah. I want to continue talking a bit about indie games because
sure.
you said that an indie developer can ask the question. And so, how do we get to there? Like, what do we need to do? What's the correct way to get to this endpoint that you referenced, you inferred? What is that endpoint for indies? What are you trying to? What? I mean, you speaking as someone who has been in that space for a long time.
Yeah.
What is it ultimately that you want to achieve? And what do you think indies should be wanting to achieve, if there is such a thing?
I'm not sure that there's a statement that I could make that's true. In fact, I know there's absolutely no statement that I could make that's true across the entire sector, right?
Right.
For me personally, I have ideas about game design that I want to explore. And, those change from game to game because what happens is I go into a game with things I want to explore. And in the process of designing and making that game, I learn about those things. And then that has progressed my thought onto a new place that could then be explored by the next game, mm-hmm. if everything goes well, which so far it has. So, like, I kind of don't know where that's going to go exactly, right? So, like back in the Braid timeframe, there was a certain mindset of like mechanical experimentation within a tight framework, and making that like consistent and following all the consequences of the rules being laid out, right? And so The Witness after that was not really about that. It was more like, let's take some of that stuff we saw in Braid, like nonverbal communication that was happening, and let's do something built around nonverbal communication and see how far we could push that. And also this exploration of what the possible puzzle space is. But instead of in Braid, where it was in a tight framework, in The Witness, we let it be very loose, right? So like Braid was like there's some number of worlds, and every world has 12 puzzle pieces in it, and each puzzle piece is a puzzle. And in The Witness, it's just like, well, some areas have a bunch of stuff and some areas are small, and we just sort of let them be sized based on how much interest we found in that particular subdomain of the puzzle space. And The Witness was more about building a large and complex body of ideas, whereas Braid was like a tight and focused body of ideas in some way. And then the game that we're doing now, which doesn't have a name yet, is much more about exploding out the combinatorics even way further than The Witness did, right?
Okay.
So that's just something that I've become interested in for reasons that, I don't know, maybe I can make them make sense, but
go for it. I mean, I think that's the whole point here, is just to, if you can share what motivates you to take those ideas farther, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me go back to something for a second, because one of the things that always rubs me the wrong way is, and things that rub me the wrong way and motivate me to design things, right? Because I'm like, no, I want to do this thing that works a different way. There's a certain kind of rhetoric about puzzle design that I think is prevalent in the industry, to the point where a lot of puzzle game players talk about things this way. There's this reverence for like the aha moment, I think it's most often called, where like you finally get it and you solve the puzzle. And I think we have.
Okay, wait, before you go on, a real quick question. Why do you think there is a reverence for that aha moment?
Because there is something powerful and good about it.
Okay.
However, we I don't know how to say. So the culture of game development, which is embedded in sort of the Western culture that we have more broadly, is a little bit decadent in this area, such that we don't recognize the actual value of that thing. And so what people think the aha moment is that like something that I've heard players say over and over is that, oh, they got to feel smart, right? Or they I don't know, something like that. And that's fine. Like, that's all fine. Like, it's cool to feel smart. And then the way I've heard developers talk about it is, well, just as the aha moment, as in like, that's the kind of situation we're trying to set up for people. So we like set up the level or whatever and the constraints so that people could have this like aha, right? And the thing is, on the one hand, those things are all true. On the other hand, they're all kind of shallow and not the important part, right? The important part is something about like what you realize when you have this moment, and what else it connects to in your experience. And those are things that designers often seem to ignore because maybe they're more intangible and harder to think about. And I don't know, with players, it's not their job to think about why they're having a good experience with a game. So that's fine. But so the way that I hear this talked about in the industry, I find personally very dissatisfying, and in fact not conducive to good puzzle design, actually. So in The Witness, for example, on the one hand, you could say in this traditional industry lexicon that it's a game all about the aha moment, right? Like, because what we try to do is set that sort of thing up over and over again in different ways. But the way that I think about it is actually pretty different, because what that game is more concerned about is the content of the realization you have, not the fact that you like solved a puzzle and felt smart. It's like, what did you see about this particular scenario that you now understand that you didn't understand before? And can we hook that up to other things that you understand, right? And this is always there in games. It's just a question of where's your emphasis as a designer, I think.
So can you give me an example from Witness? Because having played and experienced the different approaches you take to puzzles and seen sort of how you build mechanics along the way,
Yeah.
I do get what you're talking about. Like, I felt like it wasn't just one aha moment. There were a lot of moments of success that were kind of linked to previous moments where I could see the trail, like, of learning moving through the game. But I guess I'm interested to understand if is there something I'm missing, like the holistic experience you're talking about. What are you trying to elicit from players that maybe is more subconscious? Like, what do you want them to be walking away from that's what do you want them to walk away with that may be different than, say, just solving a set of puzzles?
Okay. Yes, this is hard to talk about. And this is a sort of thing that changes from game to game, right? But in that particular game, the puzzles were all, I would say, within a certain family of puzzles, right? There were gameplay reasons why, we have these, LCD panel kind of things in the world that make the puzzles very explicit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at least at the beginning of the game. And they start out very abstract with just like shapes in a grid. And over the course of the game, I would say they get a little bit less abstract, but we're exploring a certain space there. Like, the abstract beginnings allow us to sort of talk about really fundamental concepts without other distractions, like like placement of things, like shapes or something relative to each other, or going around things versus through things or whatever, right? But these are all like ideas about space that happen in the world. And then, as we go further through the game, there are puzzles that bring in more elements. So, like light and shadow and, color, like light moving through the environment, and all these things start to matter. And so it becomes an exploration of, like, what are some things just about the reality that we live in that are really basic, and can we like appreciate how interesting those are? And so, there aren't puzzles in The Witness that are like, you find a note on the ground and it's a cryptogram and you have to figure out what letter corresponds to what other letter, right? There's not like a sliding tile puzzle like every adventure had forever. And it's because those things would be puzzles that people could solve, but they would be pretty far from the idea that the game was trying to get at. Now, at the same time, okay, so here's the thing though. When I'm interested enough, especially because we're indie and spending a long time experimenting and getting things really right with a small team, sometimes these games take a long time, right? I mean, that's true for most games these days. But Witness took a long time. And so for me to spend a long time on something like that, I have to be like really interested in it, right? So when I start the game, I usually don't fully understand what we're going to do, because it needs to be about something that I'm so compelled to study that I wouldn't mind spending a long time working on it and discovering new things over the course of that process. Right. And so, and then even after that, like, it's hard for me to tell you everything that the Witness puzzles are about, like verbally, right? But in part because so much of it is nonverbal, but also because, like, part of my satisfaction as a designer is subconscious. It's like I'm balancing all these really complex decisions about what we're making and come up with something. And I could sort of explain to you reasons why that's the right answer, but a lot of it is a little too complicated for my forebrain, right? And so like the hidden deeper parts of the brain um, weigh in on that. And those things are hard to communicate sometimes too. But what's interesting to me about The Witness too is like the nonverbal communication and then the talking about these basic things in reality, they seem like totally different ideas, but they interplay with each other very well and they support each other very well. And so like I was on a podcast with someone a long time ago, it was a couple of years ago, who is not from the games industry. It was actually Adam Conover's podcast. So he like does some shows and he does comedy and stuff. And he was like, he said, as someone who doesn't think about games from a design standpoint, he said, you know, there were a couple puzzles in The Witness that were like actual jokes, like in the same sense that a comedian would tell a joke. And that was really weird to see this thing non-verbally, right? And I was like, oh, wait, someone who doesn't make games like saw that and thinks of it that way. Like somehow there's a very high level of expression that happened, starting with these very fundamental things, right? And playing with them in this complex manner. And I don't know. So that's what that game was about. Somehow.
Okay.
But then the next game that we're doing is not really about a lot of that, right?
Well, yeah, you said, I mean, and let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it'd be great to, if you're comfortable, to understand more of how you're, taking your design further. You said that you're interested in exploring the combinatorial aspects, I guess, of something. Is it puzzles? Is there, how much can you share about what you're doing? And
well, okay, so going back to games like Braid or The Witness for a second, in order to explain this, so we, or back to the aha moment kind of discussion we just had, which I can't believe I'm saying that phrase so much because I hate the phrase. Moments of epiphany, I would say, is better the way that I like to think about them. So you can think about these moments in isolation also, right? And that again leads to this thinking that's what is valuable is actually having that moment and feeling good about playing the game, right? But again, I think that's a little too shallow of a viewpoint. And so when I said before that the content of them matters, part of what that means is that you have many of these moments and the content in each of them is related to the content of the other ones, and it forms together some kind of interrelated, connected structure that is intangible, right? Mm-hmm. That having played the game, you can see in some way or have some appreciation for. And again, so this is something that varies among players, right? So some players play games with a lot of attention, like especially if it's their kind of game, and other people just sort of, casually play. But depending on the degree of what you invest playing, you sort of get more or less of a view of this very elaborate, intricate structure that is totally intangible, right? And that to me is part of what is interesting about games fundamentally. And that's true about all kinds of games. So not just puzzle games. So, taking a battle royale game, for example, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is one that I use typically as an example of this. If you play that game a bunch and get good at it, you understand this very big system of what's going on as a player. It's like, oh, okay, the game's going to go through several phases. Like in the beginning, everyone's parachuting and then sort of rushing to loot really fast. People are generally going to be unarmored and not well armed. And so certain kinds of maneuvers are a good idea in the beginning that become less of a good idea later, right? And then depending on where the circle shows up, the flow of people might be a certain way or might not. And, I know how to act in the beginning of the game versus the middle of the game versus the end of the game. And it's based on this understanding of this very intricate system, right? And that's a thing that games have that movies don't have, right? TV shows actually have something a little bit like that, like these really long form TV shows that go for like several seasons in since like The Sopranos and whoever changed the format of TV shows, right? They build up some intricate structures as well. So this is something that's like that, but it's not about, like in fiction, it's about like plot and character or something, but in games, it's not. It's about like the workings of this system that happen. Anyway, so game designers professionally, their job is to build some kind of system like this that is going to work well and be interesting and that people would like to play. And if you go to a conference forever, people have been talking about this, and there's some kind of idea that people have of how to make games interesting, from a mechanical standpoint, right? As completely separate from, whether the story and characters are interesting or whether the art is good or anything like that. And it has something to do, like, the really cheesy version of it. It's actually not that cheesy because it's useful sometimes, but you can make this like 2x2 matrix of like all the objects in your game. And it's like, do they interact with each other? And put a little check mark if this object interacts with that one. And if that matrix doesn't have very many interactions in it, then most of the things in your game sort of have one purpose, and maybe it feels kind of dead. Maybe the player is never going to be surprised by the way in which they discover to use something, or they're never going to observe something surprising happen that they didn't cause. Whereas if that matrix is like full of check marks, then there's a lot of possibility that can dynamically play out within the space of the game. Okay. So that's something designers have been trying to do for a long time. But, like we've said, games are a lot of work and making games is hard. So typically what happens is, a designer goes to a certain space. It's like, oh, I'm making a puzzle game, or, oh, I'm making a shooter or whatever. You come up with some system that seems like it's going to be exciting and generate emergent behaviors and whatever. You look at that, you make it, the initial idea of what that was going to be is probably not totally accurate, right? You try it out, you refine it a little bit, you come up with something, you ship the game's fun, the end, right? And so from the perspective of exploration of game design, there's a certain point that we keep stopping at, which is like, oh, this was sufficient to have a good game. So there we go, that's the design, and then move on, right? And so what this new project is like, what if we start there, like where people usually finish, right? So what if we start with a number of rule sets, all of which have been figured out to be interesting like that, and then we make them compatible with each other in some way, and then try to do the combinatorics of those to get like a super combinatoric explosion, and then try to manage that explosion somehow into something playable. Then in some sense, we would be taking this thing that is like the thing that is understood to be intrinsically valuable, or one of the things understood to be intrinsically valuable about game design, and then explicitly exploring it out in a territory where just nobody thought to go for some reason. Or I don't know. I mean, I guess people decide to make more complicated games sometimes, but that's kind of an uncontrolled way, or an unfocused way of making this interaction matrix bigger. Whereas in fact, what we're doing is sort of a much more focused way of trying to maximally explode that thing.
Does this mean then that you want to keep going until you've reached sort of that acceptable level of chaos and emergent mechanics, or you want to release something, see how it goes, and just continue to add to it once it's out there?
So there are sort of two projects related to this idea. One of them we're not really working on right. One of them I did a prototype of a while back, and then we had to go do a bunch of other stuff. So we're going to work on it again later. The one we're working on right now is like a pre-authored version of this. So we do this kind of like particle super collider between rule sets things. We figure out what's good about that. We make a bunch of content for it a priori, and we ship all of that to people, right? So this is a level-based game. It has like 700 levels right now. It's going to have probably more than 1,000. And, they all have to look good and play well, which is hard for a small independent team. For scale, right? So Braid originally, the game that I did a while back, has, I think, 70 levels. Is it really even that? No, it has 70 puzzles in fewer than 70 levels. It's probably about 50 levels, which still seems like a lot bigger. Like, I can't believe that game is that big. But anyway, I'm gonna have to go count again to make sure that number is accurate. And I can't even be 50. It's got to be like 30. It's got to be some small number. It's a 2-digit number, though. Like, the number of levels in Braid.
So you're talking about something that's maybe 200 times, 150 times the size of that one. If you compare, if levels have the same meaning between the games.
Yeah. And then also, like, it's a 3D game instead of a 2D game, and like all these things, right?
But significantly larger is what you're talking about.
Significantly larger.
Okay.
And so, well, for this game, again, the idea is to go way past where people usually go. So it's not about stopping when we have something playable, because we could have done that a long time ago. It's about, let's take these initial ideas that are colliding and observe what's interesting about that, and then make some levels that illustrate every interesting thing that we can find in this space, up to a certain point. It turns out this space is like so huge that there's no way we could do everything. It would be insane. But whenever you do this, we even had this in The Witness. It's like, at some point, like, there are some ideas that seem very naturally fitting in with the game that you have so far. And then as you keep exploring, at some point you kind of cross some boundary where things start to get more tenuous. And it's like, well, yeah, we could do that, but it's a little bit of a stretch. And then it becomes more and more of a stretch, right? And so you find that place where it starts being a stretch, and you just sort of make that the border of the space that you're doing, right? And so as long as we do that, the game is still kind of tractable. But so this version is, or this game that we're doing right now is just all I mean, we might do expansion packs and stuff for it, but the main idea will be delivered with the original game. Now, there's another project that I have that is supposed to be the same kind of exploration, but done in iterations over a long time. And we'll see how that goes too. I think that'll be fun, but we're still very early in that one.
Okay. And on both of these games, you've created a new language, right?
Yes.
And is it Jai? Is
that sure. I don't, it's a working title that okay. So I have a weird mental thing about this. So to me, I don't ever use I don't ever, I treat it as if it's a programming language that has no name. And the reason for that is that in the technical world, in the programming language world, as well as everywhere else, it's full of people who like want to do their project and then sell you on their project. So like the standard this is something that I wish I could communicate better. I need to figure out about it. But the standard format in like even research papers sometimes, but especially you go on like a technical website like Hacker News or somewhere, similar things of the past, and someone's announcing their thing. And the standard format is like some name for the project they made up, and then colon, and then some description of what it is. But the name, it goes first. It's like it's so subliminally, people are so concerned with selling the thing that they tell you this content-free, cute name that they made up before you even know if you should care about the name, because you don't even know what it is yet. Like, that bothers me so much. And so like the current technical universe that we live in is sort of the product of people doing a lot of these very low quality things and like flooding the space with all these things. And that was the tactically correct thing to do for a long time if you wanted to succeed. But now we're like in a different space where almost everything is that. And so I think the tactically correct thing.
Jonathan, just so I understand, when you say making a lot of low quality things and flooding the space with them, are you talking about tool sets and engines, languages?
Not exactly engines, because engines are so big and complicated, because by the time you could say that you have an engine, like that's been really a lot of work, right? But like, it depends on what area you're talking about. So in academia, there's like algorithms that people make up that claim to be faster at things or to solve problems better, right? And usually they don't. In industry, depending on which industry it is, so in the web, it's like, oh, here's our library that helps make things better, or here's our JavaScript framework that helps make things better, or you know,
Gotcha.
now like in games, in the amateurs who want to do game stuff, there's a bunch of people doing like components of or pieces of an engine that are trendy. So like everybody started doing like entity component system libraries, which is like the most absurd, useless thing that I could think of, actually. And you know, they give them their cool name and whatever. And like there's just so much of that, and there's so few people actually trying to solve the really hard problems. So I went into this saying my focus is going to be on actually solving the hard problems. Oh, that's actually another point, which is just when you want people to adopt your cool thing that you're trying to like sell them, and I say sell them with air quotes because a lot of times maybe this thing is free or whatever if it's an open source library, but by sell, it's like get people to adopt it and use it, right? The way to do that is to give people the impression early on that this thing will help you be very productive or solve your problems or, you know, help you get things on the screen quickly. Actually, this concept goes all the way up to game engines, right? Like if you could just start using a game engine and get a dude walking around on the screen in the first day, that's amazing, right? But like, actually, those aren't really the hard problems, right? And the whole issue with everything that we're doing right now is that the hard problems are all being neglected because they don't get attention like that. And so everybody gets sold on things that solve the easy problems.
What's an example of a hard problem that you think should be
like
solved?
how, so, you know, games are hard to make, right? So once, by the time you've got a whole game together that wants to do a lot of very complex things, how do you like manage that complexity without your brain exploding, right? Like that's just really hard. I don't know how to solve that still. I have some ideas that help, right? Um, how do you make a lot of these? So if you look at a game engine, for example, all the concepts involved, both the technical concepts, the design concepts, like the art concepts of how art people like to think about the things that they manipulate and all that. It's just a huge amount of stuff to understand. And like, can that stuff be simplified, right? Like, is there a better framework that allows, because the more complicated it is to understand, the less somebody, for example, who's highly specialized in one part of working on a game can even understand about what everyone around them is doing, right? And the less understanding of that you have, the less efficiently a team works together, right? And so, you know, are there improvements we could make there? Yes. What are they? Well, that's actually a very difficult question, right? And then while we're doing all this, you know, in games, we keep wanting to expand the capabilities of what we're doing. And we're still able to do that somehow, but not as quickly as in the past, right? Like graphics aren't getting better at the rate they used to. Gameplay isn't getting more complicated at the rate that it used to. So we're kind of hitting some kind of diminishing returns wall. We haven't totally hit a wall yet. Games are still getting bigger and more impressive, but I mean, everybody has noticed that it's getting harder and harder to do that, I think. And so I think it would be helpful for us to start trying to solve some of these problems. And that was the mindset I went into this with.
And we used to went into this and into designing a new language, right?
Yeah. And I started doing that a long time ago, in 2014. And so, you know, in any project that you work on that long, I've learned from the project as I've done it, and my idea of what exactly is the best thing to do has evolved quite a bit since that beginning, but I'm very happy with where we are on it. Again, the biggest problem is just there's a lot of work to do. But it's actually, I mean, one thing that I predicted at the outset was like, okay, on the one hand, nobody ever does this. Because like making a programming language, I mean, in the old days, people used to make programming languages, right? But there were lower expectations for what a programming language was back then. And so now today, to make a new programming language, it just seems like such a huge task. Like and I should specify a programming language like for actual real professional programmers to build an engine in, right? Not like a scripting language and all that, like people do sometimes still. Although even that has sort of gone by the wayside. Like that is seen to be such an enormous task that nobody wants to really invest in that infrastructure, let's say. And so we keep plodding along with the technical infrastructure that we have, which is honestly pretty bad. And it gets worse all the time as our programs scale up in complexity. And the prediction that I made was like, actually, it's going to be easier to make this thing in terms of amount of work than it is to make a video game. And so like the entire industry is suffering all this friction. Even so, my company is small, but like even the AAA industry is suffering a tremendous amount of friction due to these tools we're using. And actually, if people could pool together and do the effort of one video game out of these hundreds that get made, everyone would benefit from it tremendously. But that's, of course, a coordination problem and like a political problem, and that would never really actually happen. And maybe there are like local initiatives within companies to sort of explore this, but they probably don't get much in the way of resources, and they never really, and it's a big risk and all these things, right? And so my initial idea was like, oh, I'll try to convince a coalition of industry people to like put in the resources. But very quickly I was like, wait, if it's actually not that hard, I should just go fricking do it. And then of course I can make it be what I actually think it should be versus navigating some political process to like get agreement in some way that may ruin the actual thing, right? So that's what I've been doing for a while. I started it in 2014, but it was basically part-time, like on the side for like a year and a half, because that was when we were shipping The Witness and all that. And then around the middle of 2016, that became, well, my full-time job became the combination of working on designing and programming this programming language, plus also working on the combinatorial game that I told you about. Because one thing that most programming languages never really do is like work hard to make sure that they deliver on their promises early in their lifetime, right? Because early in the lifetime of a programming language is when you can adjust the design to make it better. So you really want to vet that design and make sure it's good. But most programming languages seem content with like small example programs or whatever, right? And so this was like, look, if we can make a commercial quality game that ships on consoles and PCs, that's as good as anything we've ever made or better, that at least shows you that this programming language at least works well enough to do that, right? Which is something that no other programming language has ever done. And so, that's fun, though. It's a lot of work, again, but it's been good.
Do you see the long-term benefits? Is that one of the other objectives here, is that it makes it easier to build future games and to support these games that you're describing that could live on? Is that another just sort of motivating factor for this?
Yeah, I mean, there's two levels of it, right? There's one for us as a company, right? So if I believe my thesis that we're paying a tremendous cost for using these other tools, then it's in my best interest running a company to remove that cost, right? Now,
so before you go on though,
yeah,
is that offset literally by the time that you're spending making a completely new language?
Maybe, except I actually enjoy this work though too.
Okay.
So you can't discount it all, right?
Sure.
Like at some point, what is life for if I don't get to do what I want to do? But there are other costs though, right? So like if we go hire programmers, they don't know this programming language, right?
Yeah.
And some programmers don't want to program in a new weird programming language they haven't heard of, right? So you can imagine some costs like that may change over time. Like if this thing, if we release it and people really like it and it becomes an accepted thing, then that will change. But for now, we're dealing with that, for example. So that's one level of it. But also, again, in terms of the world of programming, like if you can make a programmer 10% more efficient, which I think we can do a lot more than that. But if you could make a programmer 10% more efficient over their career, that's like a tremendous amount of work saved. Even if you count that flat as just 10% of their hours, but it's actually more than that, because basically everything involving knowledge work is some kind of exponential compounding interest curve, right? So like the more that you work on things, the better you become. That's why we like to hire senior people who are experienced, right? Because they know enough to make better decisions and to design systems better from first principles and all this sort of thing. And so if less of your time is wasted, it's just like you put a certain amount of money in the bank and it compounds year over year. If you put 10% more, you're going to have more than 10% after 10 years or something, because that 10% also compounded, right?
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. And so that's how I think of it. Like, I think about it as there's a tremendous efficiency to be gained in the world of programming, broadly speaking. Now, that said, the world of programming outside games has like even a lot more worse problems than this. Like, it's astonishing to me how bad all that stuff is. The thing about games is games like have to keep it real in a way that most people don't, right? So like computers got really fast. Computers now, compared to when I started in games, are amazing supercomputers. Like I wouldn't have imagined in the 90s that we could do what we can do today. I wouldn't have known how to picture it, right? So like we're actually using this increased power of computers to do more. Now that's getting harder and harder with every generation of games. It seems to be requiring more and more silicon to get less and less of an incremental improvement, but still we're trying as hard as we can to do that. Whereas other fields are not really doing that. They're just sort of writing the same kind of software they have for a long time. They just have faster and faster computers to do it with. And so the end result of that latter situation appears to be a very large mess. Like, I don't know what else to say about it.
Well, when it comes to finishing this line, or getting to the point where you're using it in a game and you've actually released the game, do you expect to make it open source to share with people? What is
the game or the language, or
the language?
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly. So I am not that enamored of open source these days. I started out in a little bit of an open source kind of mindset. Like I went to college at UC Berkeley and did stuff in the computer labs on Unix-based workstations, and like all that stuff is connected to that. But these days, what I observe is open source is making a giant, giant mess. Like it's very painful to try to use any given open source program. It probably doesn't work the first time. I probably have to spend a long time configuring it. And all that stuff is waste, right? Again, that like, why can't I just run this program? Firstly. And then secondly, because I'm an old guy at this point, I've sort of observed that like, so I just mentioned a minute ago about hardware being amazing and games being amazing, in many dimensions compared to what I would have been able to imagine back then. But like, aside from that particular area, if you just look at software technology generally, like what does it mean to write a program? How do you do it? How do you like debug it? None of that stuff has changed fundamentally in 30 years. Like we're still doing the same stuff. And in fact, we're doing it maybe a little bit worse than we used to. It's just we're saved by the fact that computers are faster. And so like the actual technology of software has not advanced. And then if you look again, like at open source, for example, it's like people they're still sort of doing the same programs mostly, but they're even more complicated and they work even less well. And so there's not advancement, I guess, right? Everybody's always like, oh, someday we'll be able to perfect this thing. And after hearing that for 30 years, it's just like, that's not going to happen, guys, unless you change something about the way you're doing it. And so the thing that's missing from open source is the kind of product mindset where somebody is responsible for the end experience of using this thing, right? And I guess in a couple of cases that was supposed to happen, like Red Hat and Ubuntu or something, but they don't seem to be doing a very good job of that, honestly. And so, but for the most part, like any random open source program there's like not somebody responsible for the experience of using that. And that's a very important part of keeping it real, right? And so I don't know, you get this kind of culture where like this thing is maybe not very good, and then everybody who uses it gets it for free, and then they complain to you that the thing that they got for free doesn't work that well for them, which maybe some of it is it not being very good, but maybe some of it is just like what they want is something different than what you're making, but they feel entitled to complain to you anyway. And then everybody thinks that they get to contribute and change the software, even if they don't program very well, right? So we have these weird things culturally. So like President Obama came out and said like, hey, all school kids should learn to code and stuff. But we don't say everybody should go build bridges that cars drive across, right? But then somehow we will say that about programming, which is actually fine. Like there's a thing about computer literacy that's like understanding how programs work and stuff, and that part's fine. But like we need to draw a distinguishment between amateur programming and serious professional programming, and we have never done that, right?
Why do we need to do that though? Why do we need to create a distinction between, say, a kid?
Because what we have is so bad. Because we're not going to be able to move on until we do that.
Move on to more efficient
software that actually works. Like we have very little in the way of fundamentally new capabilities in software technology, right? So the one thing that we have is sort of deep learning is the thing that came out lately. Very impressive in certain domains, right? Again, able to do things that I never thought that I would see. So that's great. That, however, is a very small, if you look at like software as a big, like the map of all the concepts in software, that's like a really small sliver area on the map. And like what's been happening with everything else. And what's been happening is there's this sort of churn where people propose things that are different, but not really better. Like, oh, we should program in this way. Oh, here's an object-oriented toolkit that everybody should use. Oh, here's a different one that everybody should use. Here's, everyone should use this programming paradigm. And just we go through all these things and it's like splashing but not swimming forward, right? And so until software as a whole starts swimming forward better, it's going to be hard to get anywhere. And so part of that is understanding that we need to set a goal and actually swim toward it. But part of it is also that we're encumbered by this tremendous amount of broken stuff right now. And so, yeah, anyway, to get back to your question. So I don't know if I want to deal with all the weird open source drama. So I don't know. Like, I think, so for example, for somebody at a game studio, like if I think my model of like, okay, in the games industry, if I wanted this language to be adopted, how would that work? Well, people have all these, anyone who would use this probably has engine technology that they've already invested in, and that's already in a different programming language and whatever. They might experiment a little bit with DLLs or like tools, right? Like, oh, we're going to make a new tool to do something. So let's try this language. Even if I were to use something for tools, I probably would want source because it's just, I'm adopting this experimental thing. Like I need the ability to deal with problems, and you can't do that without source, right? So there's this problem of like, how do you enable that without enabling the open source drama that becomes a massive time and effort sink and drives the project into the ground, right? And so figuring that out is one thing, right? But then on the other side, so with the game, we also want to give out the source to that, but in a different way. Because part of what I want to do, okay, so imagine you're a programmer who's like young, maybe high school age even, and you want to do game stuff or something cool like that. Games are so complicated, it's very hard to just start making something to get off the ground. Like you could make a little like Pong kind of a game in 2D if you're learning or something, but that's so different from like, like I'm playing Call of Duty Warzone this afternoon and then I go home and I make a little Pong game. Like it's hard to even see the connection between those things. So then maybe you start using an engine like Unreal or Unity, but then the only way you can connect to those, well, unless you're a very experienced programmer, the way that you connect to those with programming is like, it's just like little snippets that plug into the thing. And that's fine, but like that lets you do small things, but it doesn't help educate, for example, a new generation of engine developers, right? Or people who really know how to struggle with the hard technical problems. And so what I want to do with the source code to this game is like, hey, look, here's a non-trivial game written in this programming language. You could just grab it right now, and you can make it your own thing, like however you want, right? And we're trying to structure it so that the code of the game so that it's very malleable that way. So there are different pieces that you could use, and maybe just comment out some other stuff that you don't want to use. But like to provide an in for people who actually want to start experimenting with a program, as opposed to like plugging a small thing into like a giant thing. But that part will be easier because that doesn't necessarily introduce open source drama. It's just like we throw the source over the wall and say, here, guys, have this, have fun.
That sounds great. I mean, that sounds like a really useful alternative to people who are, getting in and want to maybe sidestep some of the baggage that comes with traditional coding. And speaking of getting in, I wanted to ask you a couple of last questions about just the industry and getting into the industry, because as you said, you've been in it for a long time. You've built a company, you've made your own games. And you've thought obviously really long and hard about design, from a lot of perspectives. What advice, what are just a couple of pieces of advice you have for designers who are brand new to the industry? Simple.
Have opinions about what you don't like, right? Which some people seem afraid to, not exactly, afraid is not the right word, but I think there's a cultural discouragement from that, right? And again, I mean, empty criticism is not very good, right? So if you're starting out, especially, you don't know all the hard work that it takes to make something, right? And you don't know the reasons why decisions were not made the way that you would rather have them made. Very often it's like, because the thing that you would like is impossible, or the production constraints were just too heavy, or whatever, right? But at least knowing how to be dissatisfied with what currently exists, because that's a very good way to form a picture for what could exist that you could design, right? And so, but there's a difference between, smart dissatisfied and dumb dissatisfied, right? Again, so dumb dissatisfied is just like, I have some idealistic picture of what's a good design that I built in my head, but I haven't worked through how this meshes with reality in any way, right? But smart dissatisfied is like, oh, I played PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds a bunch, and I played Call of Duty Warzone a bunch, and I've thought a bunch about battle royales, and like, I really don't like this assumption that they're all making, or something like that. Like having a very specific idea of what you don't like, because that then you can take and turn into something that you would like. And that gives you a more tractable starting point than just like, okay, sit down, design something. The space of all games is open to you. Like, design something. It's like, where do I start? What do I do? How do I make sure it's good? Like, if you start thinking about an existing game design, you have a baseline for how good it could be. It's like, it's at least as good as the thing that already exists. And then it's your job to make it at least better, right? And it's surprisingly easy to accidentally make things worse, and learning that is interesting too. I don't know if that's that's my advice.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
And if another broad question for you is, how would you like to see our industry change over the next decade? Because it's changed a lot over the last decade. So looking ahead 10 years, what are a couple things you'd like to see improve?
Do you mean the internal parts of the industry, or the part that faces the public? Or
how about one of each?
Okay, well, internally, it's just so hard to make games now, right? And this is being addressed, like more people are adopting engines, right? Like Unreal or something, which helps with part of this, but it actually doesn't help with another part of it, which is, like if you're trying to be ambitious and make something specific, then a general tool is not going to address that specific topic very well. And then you may actually have a harder technical problem of like adapting the tool. Like, something like Unreal is, it's built to try to solve everybody's problems to some reasonable level. So it's way more code than you would actually have if you were just trying to solve your own problems. And so then when you try to expand it, it's just way harder to deal with, right? So people have been shifting to using engines for stuff, which actually, if you just want to make a game that's like another game that you saw, that's already well covered in, maybe that's a tactically correct thing. But if you actually want to like push the boundary and compete with other top games who are doing leading edge things, I think it's a lot harder if you license an engine actually than if you have home built tech. But either way, regardless of which way you make that choice, there's still just so much work involved in making games and so much friction, and it takes so long to make ideas actually happen. And some of that is unavoidable because games are really complicated. And once you start thinking about what an idea actually implies and all the little checklists that have to be made sure that all these things are good, it's like a lot of things, right? But if we can at least reduce the friction on all those things, like I don't think it's unreasonable that we could, if we had a magic wand to like just make all our tools and processes better, I think we could make games twice as fast. And that they would still take a long time, but like, they would take longer than they took in the 80s or whatever, but that would just be tremendously better for everybody's quality of life and like budgets and all these things, right? And so internally, I would like that. Externally, I think video games has a little bit of an ambition problem right now, in the sense that they're obviously so interesting when you really understand them. And we sort of feel like for a while, like in the 80s and 90s and stuff, people were saying, oh, video games are going to be the future, right? And now like video games are there's a huge industry, lots of people play them, everybody knows what they are. And we sort of feel like, people don't explicitly say this, but I think it's sort of assumed that we reached the end point of what video games are to culture. It's just like what we have, but maybe bigger and more ambitious and maybe in VR or something, right? Like, I don't even know. Maybe we'll have neural stimulus later, but like that seems a little short-sighted to me, or a little bit unambitious. Like, video games are new, both as a design technology and as a, the technological technology. And so we found some success in exploring what they can do that people will want to interact with. Great. So like, why stop there? Like, why not keep going and seeing how, like when I think about what even I am excited about in the future technologically, it's like SpaceX rocket. And like, I'm not a Bitcoiner, but I understand people who think Bitcoin, right? Nobody is thinking video games anymore. And why not? Like, it seems to me like there's a lot more that we have to go, but like, we don't seem to believe it or something. And there's weird exceptions. So like, like Fortnite does some wacky stuff, like holding concerts in Fortnite and then like being down for 4 days intentionally, right? So those things are culturally relevant in a way that, like, I don't think being down for 4 days intentionally is the future, but like, it's reaching outside of the currently conventionally drawn boundaries to say like, here's some stuff that we could do that would be cool, right? And it's exploring more. And I wish that we would do a little bit more of that. And that ties into what the earlier part of the discussion about like, well, you do kind of have to be conservative with large budgets. But then, I don't know, there's some point at which, like, there's some things that indie developers can't do. Like, we can iterate game mechanically. We can't like experiment with cultural phenomena intentionally very easily. I mean, sometimes that happens. Like sometimes you get Minecraft and it's like a game that one dude made, but it's like, that's really something you do with a budget, right? You don't like, you know, you don't like have a big event at like, some giant music festival or something as a bedroom indie. That's just not a thing. And so the people who have this capability, I don't think are using it as well as they could, in my opinion. That's all.
So okay. Last question. So
Sure.
at some point, if you retire from the industry,
Mm-hmm.
if you ever leave it, what do you want people to say about your games?
I kind of don't care anymore. So like back when I was working on Braid and that came out, like part of the picture that I had behind making the game was to show that certain kinds of art games were feasible. And so I was very concerned I was very interested with, like, to what degree is that message successful or whatever, right? And then by the time The Witness came out, I was so totally over that I didn't even read reviews of the game. Aside from, I read a couple from like people that I knew or whatever, but I was really not interested in what reviewers or anyone had to say about the game. And part of that was that I'd had experience with being kind of disappointed by that before, but part of it was also like The Witness was such a deep exploration that lasted for such a long time that like someone who comes along from the outside, like even if you play a game for 100 hours, which seems like a long time, right? Like if I worked on this game for, I'm trying to do math in my head right now, so say I worked on designing it for 6 years, right? So let's say I worked 300 and something days a year times, I don't know, like let's just say 2,500 hours a year. I don't know, for 6 years, that's 15,000 hours, right? And so for someone who worked on something as hard as they could for 15,000 hours, like there's certain kinds of feedback you can get from people who experienced it for 100 hours, but like they're more of the reality check kind of feedback. Like, oh, I wanted this thing to come across in a certain way. Did it in fact come across in that way to people who played it or whatever, right? That's what you can get out of that. But the deeper things that I care about, the things that drive me to like work for that many hours on something, nobody else is ever going to know about, aside from like a very small number of peers who are working in adjacent areas. And so I've sort of come to grips with this fact that like what I think about all day and what I do is unknown by most people, and that's fine. And then so whatever they have to say about what I do is not informed by that, which is also fine. Like it's their right to say whatever they want about it, and but for me, the important part is the actual work that's being done. And yeah, also I've just seen, again, we're in the age of social media where I've seen so many people just like there's this rampant spreading of very weird, even when the ideas aren't false, like very unfounded ideas that people just grab and run with. Like I don't want to say cynicism about that exactly, because it's hard to even, it's more like I've just observed that phenomenon and seen how baseless most of this kind of discussion is. And I don't care. Like, I just don't care what a lot of people have to say about a lot of things anymore. That's been the achievement of social media, is it has cheapened speech to the point where probably most people don't care about most of it. So that's how I feel.
Got it. Well, that's thank you, and I appreciate you sharing so much today about your views, your games, the industry. Appreciate you being.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
I hope I remained focused enough. I feel like I went on wide excursions, but hopefully it's for the good.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.